In September 1774, a dangerous secret was kept in Philadelphia. 56 men from 12 of Britain's American colonies gathered behind locked doors. Their purpose was known only to a trusted few. Britain had punished Massachusetts with severe measures. The other colonies now shared a common fear. They knew that they could be next. Among the delegates were familiar faces like George Washington and John Adams. These men faced a choice that would define a continent. They had to decide between reconciliation with the crown or unified resistance. Their decision would set them against the mightiest empire on earth. To understand the anger in that Philadelphia room, we have to go back 11 years. The year 1763. Britain has just won the 7 Years' War, a conflict that spanned the globe. In America, they called it the French and Indian War. The French, Britain's great rival, were finally kicked out of North America. Victory bells rang out across the British Empire. It should have been a time of celebration. But behind the scenes, London was sweating. Winning a world war is incredibly expensive. When the accountants finished their work, the final bill was shocking. Britain was in debt to the tune of £133 million. This was a catastrophic amount of money for the 18th century. The government was desperate. So who was going to pay for all this? For over a century, Britain had practiced a policy of salutary neglect towards its American colonies. This basically meant that as long as the colonies were making money for the mother country, London left them alone. The colonists grew accustomed to running their own affairs, levying their own taxes, and enjoying a great deal of freedom. They felt like partners in the empire. That partnership was about to end. Staring at that mountain of debt, King George III and his ministers looked at the colonies in a new light. They were no longer just partners. They were a source of income. The long holiday from British interference was officially over. The first sign of this new reality was the Proclamation of 1763. The king drew an imaginary line along the Appalachian Mountains and forbid colonists from settling west of it. For Americans who had fought for that very land, this was an insult. It felt like a betrayal. The empire had won a vast new territory, only to tell its own people they couldn't touch it. It was the first of many decisions that would slowly turn loyal subjects into defiant rebels. The proclamation line was just the beginning. By 1765, London was ready for the next step. When a government needs money, it gets creative. Parliament's new idea was called the Stamp Act. This was not another tax on imported goods. This was far more personal. The act required an official British stamp on almost every piece of paper a colonist might use. We are talking about newspapers, legal documents, tavern licenses, and even playing cards. It was the first time Parliament had ever imposed a direct tax on the colonists. It went over about as well as you might expect. This lit a fuse under a very simple but powerful idea. No taxation without representation. The colonists' argument was straightforward. They had their own elected assemblies, which passed their own taxes. They had no representatives sitting in Parliament in London. So how could a distant government tax them? This was no longer about money. It was a fight over a fundamental right. While politicians wrote angry letters, others took to the streets. Secret organizations, most famously the Sons of Liberty, began to form. They appeared in cities like Boston and New York with one simple goal. They would make the Stamp Act impossible to enforce. Their methods were very direct. They organized riots and public demonstrations. They also made personal visits to the homes of the men appointed to be stamp distributors. An effigy hanging from a tree outside your window was a strong hint. Many found a new line of work. But this was not just about street brawls. Something far more important was happening. Delegates from 9 colonies gathered for the Stamp Act Congress. This was a dress rehearsal for the future. They drafted a unified petition to King George, stating only their own assemblies could tax them. Faced with riots, boycotts, and a united political front, London backed down. The Stamp Act was repealed a year after it was passed. The colonists had won a major victory. They had learned that when they stood together, they had real power. Had Parliament learned its lesson? Parliament's lesson from the Stamp Act had a very short shelf life. By 1773, London faced a problem that feels strangely familiar. A massive corporation, the British East India Company, was on the verge of bankruptcy. This company was simply too big to fail. The government solution was the Tea Act. This was not a new tax on the colonists. In fact, it cleverly made the company's tea cheaper than smuggled Dutch tea. But it was a trap, and the colonists saw it a mile away. The act maintained a small symbolic tax from years before. It was a calculated move to trick Americans into finally accepting Parliament's right to tax them. The colonists were not interested in being tricked. In Boston, 3 ships arrived carrying the controversial cargo. They were the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver. A tense standoff paralyzed the harbor for weeks. The governor refused to let the ships leave until the tea tax was paid. The deadline for payment was December the 16th. On that cold night, thousands of Bostonians gathered at the Old South Meeting House. A final, desperate plea to the governor was rejected. Samuel Adams then stood and gave what many believed was a prearranged signal. From the streets came the sound of war whoops. A group of men appeared disguised as Mohawk Indians. This was not about fooling anyone. It was a symbolic act, showing they identified as Americans, not British subjects. They marched to the docks in organized, disciplined groups. Over the next 3 hours, they systematically boarded the ships. This was not a chaotic riot, but a precise operation. Heavy chests of tea were hoisted onto the decks. The men used hatchets to smash open the crates, dumping the contents into the cold harbor water. The scale of the destruction was staggering. 342 chests of tea were sent to the bottom of the sea. The financial damage was equivalent to over $1.7 million today. This was purely an act of political protest. The only other property damaged was a single padlock. Colonists reportedly replaced it the next day. A clear message had been sent across the Atlantic. The colonists would not be manipulated or bullied. Britain's response would be furious, and it would push the colonies closer to unity than ever before. When news of the destroyed tea reached London, the reaction was not just anger. It was pure fury. Parliament saw the Boston Tea Party as an act of open rebellion, a direct challenge to its authority. There would be no more debates. There would be no more negotiations. The time for talking was over. Their response came in March 1774 with the Boston Port Act. This was the first of what the colonists would call the Intolerable Act. It was designed to be a crushing, targeted blow. The law was brutally simple. On June the 1st, the port of Boston would be closed to all shipping, sealed shut by the Royal Navy. Imagine a modern city having its airports, highways, and internet all cut off at once. That was Boston Harbor to the city of Boston. It was the heart of its economy, the source of its food, and its connection to the world. Suddenly, it was silent. Ships bobbed uselessly at anchor. Thousands of sailors, dock workers, and merchants were out of a job overnight. The city was being slowly strangled. Parliament's terms for reopening the port were equally stark. The people of Boston had to pay the British East India Company for every last leaf of tea at the bottom of the harbor. They also had to prove to the king that they were once again obedient, loyal subjects. In short, Boston was being held hostage until it begged for forgiveness. But London made a monumental miscalculation. They believed they could isolate Boston and make an example of it. They thought the other colonies would see the punishment and back down, relieved it was not them. The exact opposite happened. Instead of fear, the The Port Act sparked a wave of sympathy and solidarity. The other colonies saw Boston not as a criminal, but as a martyr. From Virginia, George Washington wrote that the colonists must now assert our rights or submit to every imposition. Words were followed by actions. Food and supplies began to flow into Massachusetts, not by sea, but overland. Wagons loaded with rice from South Carolina and flour from Pennsylvania rumbled towards the besieged city. Britain had meant to cut Boston off. Instead, the other colonies were building a lifeline, proving they were all in this together. If strangling Boston's economy was the first punch, the second was aimed directly at its soul. On May 20th, 1774, Parliament passed the Massachusetts Government Act. This was not about taxes or trade. This was about power. For decades, the colony had operated under its charter of 1691. This was its constitution, a legal document that guaranteed a degree of self-government. With a stroke of a pen, London tore it up. The act unilaterally rewrote the rules of Massachusetts politics. The changes were devastating. The upper house of the legislature, the governor's council, had always been elected by the people's representatives. Now, its members would be appointed directly by the king. Sheriffs and judges would also be appointed, not chosen locally. In an instant, a government of the people became a government of the crown. But the most personal blow was struck against the town meeting. These gatherings were the bedrock of New England democracy. It was where citizens debated local issues, chose their officials, and spoke their minds freely. The new law restricted them to a single meeting per year. Any additional meetings required the governor's explicit permission. And who was this new governor? London sent a man who embodied their new approach. General Thomas Gage, the commander-in-chief of all British forces in North America, was appointed to the job. The line between civil government and military occupation had just been erased. The message to the other colonies was chillingly clear. The Boston Port Act proved their economies could be destroyed. The Government Act proved their political freedoms could be abolished overnight. What was happening to Massachusetts was no longer a punishment. It was a blueprint. Every colonial charter was now just a piece of paper that Parliament could discard whenever it wished. News of a government being dismantled and a city being starved could not be contained. In 1774, information traveled at the speed of a horse, but the colonists had created their own version of a high-speed network. It was called the Committees of Correspondence. These were groups of letter writers in each colony. They were the 18th century internet, a web of riders and messengers sharing every new outrage from London. When word of the intolerable acts hit the road, this network exploded into action. The message was clear. What was happening to Massachusetts today could happen to Virginia or Pennsylvania tomorrow. Down in Virginia, the reaction was swift. The House of Burgesses, their elected assembly, passed a resolution of solidarity with Boston. The royal governor, Lord Dunmore, was not amused. He promptly dissolved the assembly, basically telling them to go to their rooms and think about what they had done. But they did not go home. Instead, they walked down the street to the Raleigh Tavern. In an act of quiet defiance, they reconvened unofficially. It was here, on May 27th, that they made a revolutionary proposal. They called for all the colonies to send delegates to a general congress. This was a huge leap. It was a call to move beyond individual protests and boycotts. It was a call to create a single unified body to coordinate a continental response. The purpose was to consult upon the united interests of America. That phrase alone was a radical concept. Thanks to the Committees of Correspondence, the Virginia proposal spread like fire through dry grass. From New York to South Carolina, other colonial assemblies echoed the call. One by one, they began the process of selecting their best men to send to this unprecedented meeting. A location was chosen: Philadelphia. The stage was being set for a showdown. As delegates from across the colonies packed for Philadelphia, one invitation was never answered. A single colony was conspicuously absent, leaving an empty chair at the historic meeting. Georgia was staying home. The reasons were not a lack of sympathy. It was a matter of practical politics and immediate survival. While other colonies fumed under despised royal governors, Georgia had a leader who was genuinely popular. James Wright had overseen years of stability and growth. For many Georgians, defying him felt like a terrible business decision. But the colony's hesitation ran deeper. Georgia was the baby of the family, founded decades after the others. It was poorer, less populated, and far more economically dependent on the mother country. It was less a partner in the empire, and more like a teenager still reliant on an allowance. This dependence was a matter of life and death. Patriots in New England could debate constitutional law from the safety of their cities. Georgians faced a much more tangible threat. They shared a tense and dangerous border with the powerful Creek nation. The possibility of raids and open warfare was a constant reality. The only thing keeping them safe was the presence of British regular troops. The Redcoats were not seen as an occupying army in Georgia. They were a vital security force. Protesting against the king meant telling the only army protecting them that they were now the enemy. This was a risk they simply could not afford to take. A small radical faction in Savannah did exist, but their movement was weak and divided. Governor Wright skillfully blocked their efforts to elect delegates. He used his influence to rally cautious merchants and planters to his side. The patriot cause in Georgia simply lacked the power to overcome him. Their time to join the fight would come, but for now, survival came first. Throughout August 1774, the roads leading to Philadelphia were thick with dust. Men on horseback and in carriages made the long journey to the largest city in British North America. They were strangers to each other, representing very different colonies with unique interests. The mood was one of quiet anticipation mixed with a heavy dose of anxiety. A lawyer from Massachusetts had little in common with a planter from South Carolina. Their success was far from guaranteed. From Boston came the Adams cousins. Samuel was the firebrand, a master of backroom politics. John was the brilliant and sometimes grumpy lawyer, cautious but deeply principled. From Virginia rode the imposing figure of George Washington. He was a quiet man whose military presence spoke volumes. He was joined by Patrick Henry, an orator whose words could stir the soul of a nation. Upon arriving, their very first decision revealed the deep divisions among them. They needed a place to meet. Joseph Galloway, the Speaker of Pennsylvania's Assembly and a firm loyalist, made a generous offer. They could use the elegant Pennsylvania State House, the official seat of government. It was a respectable, dignified choice. Meeting there would signal that they were here to politely negotiate with the crown. It was the safe, established option. But the more radical delegates had another idea. They pushed for a different venue. Carpenter's Hall was a modest brick building owned by a guild of local artisans. This was a place for working men, not government officials. It stood completely outside the sphere of royal authority. The contrast could not have been clearer. The debate was short but intense. To choose the State House was to play by Britain's rules. To choose Carpenter's Hall was a symbolic declaration of defiance from the very start. They chose Carpenter's Hall. In that simple decision, before a single speech was made, the delegates sent their first quiet message. They would be charting their own course. It signaled an alignment not with colonial governors, but with the common people. On September the 5th, 1774, the doors of Carpenter's Hall were sealed. Inside, the 56 delegates faced each other, the air thick with unspoken questions. The symbolic act of choosing this hall was behind them. Now, the real work had to begin. Their first act was one of strategic unity. They needed a leader, and the choice was unanimous. Peyton Randolph, a respected delegate from Virginia, was elected president of the Congress. This was a brilliant political move. It immediately bound the powerful southern colony of Virginia to the radical cause brewing in Massachusetts. For secretary, they chose Charles Thompson, a local Philadelphia patriot, who was not a delegate himself. But that initial harmony was paper-thin. Thompson would become the neutral memory of the revolution, meticulously recording every word spoken. Once the pleasantries were over, the room split into two fiercely opposed camps. It was the central conflict that would define the entire meeting. On one side stood the radicals, and on the other, the moderates. The radicals were led by familiar faces like Samuel Adams and Patrick Henry. They were ready for a fight. They argued that years of polite petitions and angry letters had achieved absolutely nothing. Britain, they insisted, only understood one language, and that was force. They demanded a complete boycott of all British goods. They also called for the colonies to begin forming their own militias. For them, this was no longer a negotiation. It was the defense of liberty itself. This was a direct path toward confrontation. Opposing them were the moderates, led by Pennsylvania's own Joseph Galloway and John Dickinson. These men were not cowards, but they were cautious pragmatists. They looked at the radicals and saw a rush towards a disastrous war. They were horrified by the idea of fighting the world's greatest military power. These moderates still saw themselves as loyal Englishmen who just wanted their rights restored. Their goal was reconciliation, not rebellion. They urged patience and proposed a constitutional solution. Their aim was to repair the relationship with Britain, not sever it completely. Every debate and every motion would now be a battle between these two philosophies. One path led toward compromise. The other led to open conflict. Which vision for America would prevail? A small aside. If you are enjoying this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. You will help us a lot to continue making more content like this. Truly, even though it's a simple click, it's the motivation we have to continue sharing history. Thank you. The stalemate between radicals and moderates in Carpenter's Hall was about to be shattered by the sound of a horse. On September 17, 1774, a rider arrived from Boston. It was Paul Revere, acting not as a midnight alarm, but as a high-speed courier for the Revolution. He carried a document that would throw a lit torch into the already tense assembly. The document was known as the Suffolk Resolves. It was a set of 19 resolutions, drafted by Dr. Joseph Warren, a leading patriot in Massachusetts. The resolves were not a polite request for negotiation. They were a breathtaking act of defiance, a political declaration of war. As Charles Thompson read them aloud, a shockwave must have passed through the room. The resolves declared the intolerable acts to be unconstitutional, fraudulent, and void. They advised the people of Massachusetts to stop paying taxes to the Crown immediately. They urged the formation of a new independent government for the colony. And then came the final blow. The resolves called for the towns to appoint militia officers and for the people to arm themselves and begin training. This was not a petition. It was a manual for rebellion. For the moderates like Joseph Galloway, this was their worst nightmare made real. This was treason, pure and simple. For the radicals, it was a moment of vindication. Samuel Adams saw his own fiery arguments reflected back at him, now endorsed by an entire county. The time for debate was over. The Congress had to choose. Would they disavow this radicalism from Massachusetts, or would they stand with them? They took a vote. In a stunning victory for the radicals, the First Continental Congress officially endorsed the Suffolk Resolves. With that single vote, The moderates' dream of a peaceful constitutional solution was effectively dead. The Congress had just publicly backed a colony preparing for armed resistance. There was no going back now. The radicals' victory felt like a point of no return. For moderates like Joseph Galloway, endorsing the Suffolk Resolves was pure madness. He watched Congress cheer for what was essentially a declaration of rebellion. He believed he had one last chance to pull everyone back from the brink of war. On September 28th, he stood before the delegates to present his desperate gambit. It was called the Plan of Union. This was not a plan to beg or protest. It aimed to fundamentally restructure the British Empire. The plan proposed a new American branch of government called the Grand Council. Its representatives would be elected by the colonial assemblies. Presiding over this new body would be a President General, appointed directly by the King. Here was the brilliant part of the proposal. For any law about the colonies to pass, it needed approval from two places. It had to be accepted by both the British Parliament and the new American Grand Council. This created a system of mutual veto. The colonies would get a real say in their own governance. Britain, in turn, would retain its overall authority over the empire. The debate that followed was ferocious. Radicals saw it as a clever trap designed to legitimize Parliament's power over them. Moderates saw it as the only sane path forward. It was the ultimate test of two competing visions for America. One by one, the colonies cast their ballots. The final tally was agonizingly close. The plan failed by a single vote. The final count was 6 against and 5 in favor. The radicals were not satisfied with just defeating it. In a final telling move, they voted to have Galloway's plan completely erased from the official records of the Congress. They did not just want to reject the path of peace, they wanted to forget it had ever existed. With the path of compromise erased from the record, the radicals now had complete control of the agenda. Their alternative to Galloway's plan was not another polite petition. It was a weapon. This was an economic weapon, one designed to bring the British economy to its very knees. On October 20th, Congress finally made its move. They created a powerful new body called the Continental Association. This was no mere suggestion to boycott. It was a formal binding agreement signed by all 12 colonies present. It laid out a 3-stage rocket of economic pain aimed squarely at London's wallet. Stage 1 was a total ban on imports. Starting on December 1st, not a single product from Great Britain would be allowed into the colonies. This was a direct assault on the powerful British merchants and manufacturers, who absolutely relied on the American market. The message to them was brutally simple. If you want our money, you must tell your government to respect our rights. Stage 2 brought the fight to every home. Non-consumption was a personal pledge by colonists to not buy or even use any British goods. This meant no more English tea, no more fine British cloth, and no more British luxuries. It was a call for widespread personal sacrifice. It was a way for every single colonist to directly participate in the protest. To enforce this, local committees would be formed to monitor merchants and publicly shame anyone who broke the boycott. The final stage was the nuclear option. Congress set a hard deadline. If the intolerable acts were not repealed by the following year, the colonies would unleash Stage 3. This would be a complete ban on all exports to Britain. The flow of American tobacco, rice, and indigo that fueled the empire's wealth would be cut off entirely. This was a truly masterful strategy. It was a unified continental-wide declaration of economic war. The delegates were no longer asking for change, they were demanding it. They were systematically dismantling the economic relationship that held the empire together. They bet that London's merchants would feel the pain and become their loudest allies in Parliament. The association was the primary achievement of the Congress. a testament to their newfound power. A signed document in Philadelphia was one thing. Making it a reality in every small town from New Hampshire to South Carolina was another challenge entirely. An agreement on paper is useless without a way to enforce it. The Continental Association provided for this. It called for every county, city, and town to elect its own local committee of inspection. Suddenly, a new authority began to emerge across the colonies. These were not government bodies appointed by the king. They were organized by the people themselves. Committees were formed by local merchants, farmers, and artisans. They became, almost overnight, the de facto government in many places. The revolution was starting from the ground up. Their job was to make the boycott stick. The methods were simple, but incredibly effective. Committee members would visit local shops to inspect their ledgers and inventory. They watched the docks for any sign of British ships trying to unload cargo. They were the eyes and ears of the association. What happened if they found someone breaking the rules? They did not have jails or court. They had something far more powerful in a close-knit colonial society. They had the local newspaper. The committees began publishing the names of non-compliant individuals. They were branded as enemies of American liberty. Imagine your name printed for all your neighbors to see. You would be shunned at church and ignored in the market. Your business would dry up as patriots took their money elsewhere. It was social and economic exile. This grassroots pressure worked. Faced with public humiliation and financial ruin, most merchants fell in line. While royal governors wrote angry letters back to London, the real power on the streets was shifting. The committees of inspection were proving that the colonies did not just have the will to resist. They had the organization to govern themselves. With the machinery of economic war now in motion, the delegates in Philadelphia took a collective deep breath. They had created a boycott and committees of inspection. They had a framework for continental resistance. But they were not yet ready to burn the final bridge to Britain. In their own minds, they were still Englishmen. And an Englishman in legal trouble had one last, powerful court of appeal: the king himself. So even as they prepared for conflict, they decided to write one last letter. This was no quick, angry note. It was a carefully crafted legal and political document, a final attempt to reason with the crown. Adopted on October 14, 1774. It was officially called the Declaration and Resolves. This was their unified statement of principles. It was also a masterpiece of political tightrope walking. The document's purpose was twofold. On one hand, it had to be an ironclad defense of their liberties as they saw them. On the other hand, it had to profess absolute loyalty to the crown. It was the ultimate "it's not you, it's your parliament" argument. The delegates carefully listed all their grievances. It was a long and bitter catalogue of every perceived injustice since 1763. They specifically called out the acts that taxed them without their consent. They condemned the stationing of a standing army in their cities during peacetime as a threat to their freedom. They declared the intolerable acts to be a complete violation of their rights. These were the rights they believed they were owed as free-born subjects of the British Empire under its own constitution. But they were not demanding independence, not yet. This was a demand for restoration. They wanted to turn back the clock to a time before these new, aggressive policies from London. The petition was addressed directly to King George III. The tone was deliberately respectful, almost pleading at times. They referred to him as their most gracious sovereign and signed off as his loyal subjects. They were asking him, as the symbolic father of the nation, to step in. He needed to protect his colonial children from what they saw as a rogue and overreaching parliament. It was a firm but respectful appeal. The delegates in Philadelphia had now laid all their cards on the table. The next move, the one that would decide the fate of an empire, belonged entirely to the king. Something profound was happening inside Carpenter's Hall. It was a change that could not be written into a petition or enforced by a committee. It was happening in the minds of the delegates themselves. These men had arrived in Philadelphia as strangers. They were Virginians, New Yorkers, and Carolinians. They were competitors, sometimes even rivals, with deep-seated prejudices about one another. A New Englander might see a Southern planter as a lazy aristocrat. A Southerner might view a Boston merchant as a greedy, puritanical schemer. For weeks, they had argued and debated behind closed doors. They had fought over radical ideas and cautious compromises. In that shared struggle, in the act of forging a unified response to a common threat, the walls between them began to crumble. This quiet, internal revolution was given a voice by the fiery orator from Virginia, Patrick Henry. During one of the heated debates, he stood and cut through the noise with a statement that was, at the time, utterly radical. It captured the transformation that was taking place in that very room. He declared, "The distinctions between Virginians, Pennsylvanians, New Yorkers, and New Englanders are no more." He paused for effect, then delivered the final history-making line, "I am not a Virginian, but an American." Let that sink in. Today, the idea sounds obvious. In 1774, it was an earthquake. Before this Congress, the word American was mostly just a geographic label, like European. A person's true loyalty, their identity, was tied to their colony. That was their country. Henry was proposing a new, larger identity that superseded the old ones. This was perhaps the single most important achievement of the First Continental Congress. More than the boycott, more than the letters to the king, they had begun to invent the idea of being an American. This psychological shift was the essential foundation for everything that was to come. You cannot have a nation without a people who believe they belong to one. And in that hall, 12 separate peoples began to see themselves as one. The petition carrying the last hopes for peace made its slow journey across the Atlantic. When the letter from the New Americans finally arrived in London, it was met with a wall of cold silence. King George III refused to even officially receive it. For him, a document from an illegal assembly was simply beneath his notice. He had already made up his mind. In a letter written in November 1774, the king was brutally clear. He stated that blows must decide whether they are to be subject to this country or independent. The time for words, petitions, and political maneuvering was over. Parliament quickly followed the king's lead. In February 1775, they issued a formal declaration. Massachusetts, the heart of the resistance, was officially in a state of rebellion. This was not just rhetoric. It was a legal move that changed everything. It gave the government the authority to use military force to crush the dissent. Colonists were no longer subjects with grievances. They were now enemies of the state. There was one last faint attempt at a political solution. The Prime Minister, Lord North, introduced what he called a conciliatory resolution. It was a clever piece of political theater. The proposal offered to suspend all parliamentary taxes on any colony. The colony would just have to voluntarily pay for its own civil administration and military defense. But the colonists saw it for what it was. It was a cynical attempt to divide them. The plan was a test of loyalty designed to peel away moderate colonies from the radicals in New England. The offer addressed none of their fundamental complaints about their rights. It was universally rejected as a transparent trick. The message from London was now unmistakable. The king had refused to listen, and Parliament had declared them rebels. The only offer of peace was a trap. Britain's final answer would not be written on paper. It would be delivered by soldiers with muskets and bayonets. The door to a peaceful settlement had just been slammed shut and locked. The delegates of the First Continental Congress did not go home to wait quietly. They left Philadelphia with a contingency plan. They had agreed to meet again in May if London ignored their demands. While they waited for a response that would never come, the colonies began to prepare for the worst. Across New England, the radical advice of the Suffolk Resolves was being put into practice. Local militias started to drill more openly on their village greens. They were no longer just social clubs for a weekend shoot. They were practicing formations and learning to fight as a unit. More importantly, they were stockpiling weapons and gunpowder. Small but significant arsenals began to appear in quiet towns like Concord. General Thomas Gage, watching from his headquarters in Boston, knew exactly what was happening. His spies were everywhere, and he was a professional soldier watching an amateur army assemble right under his nose. His orders from London were brutally simple. He was to disarm the rebels and arrest their leaders before things got out of hand. So, on a fateful night in April, Gage finally made his move. He ordered a column of his best troops to march out of Boston under the cover of darkness. Their mission was secret but straightforward. They were to march to Concord and seize the colonial arsenal hidden there before the Patriots could react. It was one of the worst-kept secrets in military history. The Patriots of Boston were watching every move the British made. As the soldiers began to march, so did the colonial warning system. Paul Revere and other riders fanned out across the dark countryside, their horses kicking up dust on the road to war. The next morning, the British column reached the small town of Lexington. On the village green, they were met by a small group of local militia. They were farmers and blacksmiths, standing defiantly with muskets in their hands. They were not there to start a war, but to make a silent, powerful statement. Then, someone fired a shot. To this day, no one knows for sure who it was. But in that single smoky instant, everything changed. The polite petitions were over. The constitutional debates were finished. The king's prediction had come true. Blows would now decide. When the Second Continental Congress gathered in May, its agenda had been written for them in gunpowder and blood. They were no longer meeting to discuss their rights as Englishmen. They were meeting to manage a war. It lasted just 7 weeks. A blink of an eye in historical terms. Yet in that short time, a group of strangers from 12 competing colonies managed to do the impossible. They arrived as delegates of their individual provinces. They left as the leaders of a unified continent. The First Continental Congress was a monumental success. It transformed a decade of scattered protests and local riots into a coherent, organized political resistance. Before this meeting, the colonies were like 12 separate boats caught in the same storm. Now, for the first time, they were all rowing in the same direction. The delegates did not just write letters. They built a powerful machine of revolution. The Continental Association was not a mere suggestion. It was a binding economic policy for an entire continent. The committees of inspection became a shadow government, enforcing the will of the people in every town and city. Royal authority was becoming irrelevant on the ground. This new political structure was held together by a revolutionary new idea. The old colonial identities began to melt away inside Carpenter's Hall. They were replaced by a shared sense of being something different, something new. They were no longer just subjects of a distant king. They were Americans. This was the true legacy of 1774. The Congress established a precedent. It proved that a central governing body, created by and for the colonies, could work. It was the essential blueprint that the Second Continental Congress would use to declare independence and manage a war. It may have met in secret, but it was the first real government of the United States. We hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the First Continental Congress. It was that pivotal moment when 12 separate colonies, each with its own unique identity, took the first real steps toward acting as a single nation. This brief but crucial meeting laid the essential groundwork for everything that was to come. If you found this exploration of history informative, please consider liking this video, sharing it, and subscribing to our channel for more stories. Your support is what allows us to continue our work. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.